Hey everybody, welcome to From the Constituency. Of course, I'm Brian Calfano, and joining me is a guy who's got a familiar face, even though he's on radio most of the time. It's Nick Reed. He's the morning show host over at KSGF 1041. Nick, thanks for joining us on From the Constituency. Appreciate it. I know it's a little different format for us here with the podcast, but it's always good to have you on. And of course, big doings today. The dump of the Mueller report, lightly redacted. Everyone's pouring over it. You got the libs in a tizzy because I guess they couldn't get the smoking gun, or they haven't found a smoking gun yet, perhaps.
Right.
Although there is some info out there that's not quite as flattering to the president, I think, as some people may have thought after Attorney General Barr's release of that 4-page memo last month. But I'll let you just give folks some of your initial reactions to this report released today.
Yeah. Well, the release itself, Washington is a whole different world than, of course, what we're in. And this is almost like the Academy Awards. There's really actually a very small group of people who follow it and really, really care. But then there's that 3 hours or so where they broadcast the results. And a lot of people tune in, talk about it the next day, maybe watch a movie or so because of it, but then they forget about it. But it's center of the world to the people in Hollywood. I mean, they've been building up to it. It's, some of their careers are built upon what the outcome is. And the release of a report like this, particularly in this day and age, it seems to mimic that in a lot of ways. I don't know that that's positive for the rest of us, but nonetheless, that's what it is. It's really interesting. And on my show, I was telling people, listen, it really doesn't make any difference what this says. There is going to be a political contingency that continues to roll on with it because this is part of their identity at this point. And listen, Republican, Democrat, one side is always trying to create the definition of the other. And there has been a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of narrative put into Russian collusion, and a lot of eggs have been in that basket. And so just to go, I mean, did anybody realistically think, well, regardless what's in this report, that they go, oh, okay, I guess Trump was right. He didn't collude with Russia. We'll move on to something else now. One thing that is undeniable, I think, anyhow, is that there was no Russian collusion. This was pretty much expected because of that determination that was made by, even that in that memo by the Mueller folks, the Mueller report. And so that was what of course, started all of this, was determining whether or not there was that collusion. So then there's the obstruction of justice. Now, people have to understand, this is a 400 and some page report. Whenever you hear me talk about it, whenever people hear you talk about it, whenever they hear anybody talk about it, we are giving snippets of information that we've obtained, and we're trying to relay some sort of message. I would venture to say probably 90% of people who are going to be talking about this, like you and I, for people's consumption, have some sort of agenda. That's just the truth.
You have an agenda, Nick? Come on.
Right, yeah. Now, there are people of course, everyone's going to say my agenda is the truth, but I mean, that's what's interesting to me is the truth. Plus, I feel it's a little liberating. You don't have to keep track of, well, I believe this, so I got to believe this. And we're already seeing some of what I believe is the very deliberate misinterpretation. I'm trying to be very generous here of some of this information. Let me give you an example. One of the excerpts, and you're right, there's a lot of information in there in the context of whether there was obstruction of justice or not. That doesn't make the president look good. Well, first, let's agree that this was not a report to determine whether or not Trump always behaves well behind closed doors. That's not what this is about. This isn't, because I don't think we need an investigation in order to determine whether or not Donald Trump is the most polite, diplomatic person that exists, all right? We know that. But there have been a couple examples, for one, and they make great headlines. When Trump learned about the independent investigation, he said, my presidency is blanked, it's over. So I know earlier there was some talk on one of the cable news networks, and they were presenting that as in Trump realized he had been caught. Well, when you read the entirety of the report, you see what he was talking about, and he even references in that conversation. He said, I've been told by so many people, if you're president and there's an independent counsel, you're not going to get anything done. You were done for. And that's what he was talking about, his agenda, that he was going to be marred down with 2 years of what he's been marred down with. And now a person may not like his reaction to that, but that's a totally different thing than Trump believing that he had been caught doing something illegal and he was going to be kicked out of the Oval Office.
Yeah, I mean, do you think it's fair to say Trump was just really doing the unconventional? And I mean by that, when you're in trouble or when folks are circling you to try to do something negative, most people would advise you to shut up and to just play it as if everything's cool, let the lawyers take care of it, and move on. Trump, though, either because of his personality or because of his years learning at the knee of Roy Cohn and all the sort of, I got to push back on my enemies kind of mentality, essentially was, no, I'm going to get out there and I'm going to stir up the hornet's nest as much as I can. And in a way, it made him look guilty of doing certain things. And it fed into this narrative that, well, he must be doing something wrong and he must have been caught simply because look at how his reaction is. If he were truly innocent, he wouldn't be feeding all of this.
Well, I do think it is a compilation of things. Some of it is his personality. And some of that is the way he was raised in his culture. There was an author who was a longtime friend of his. I did an Author of the Week segment with him, who grew up with Trump in the business world, and it was when Trump was still running. And he said, this is Trump. This is how because he's kind of from New Jersey, New York. This is how people communicate, particularly if you're going to be successful. You're just very straight to the point. This is the way I want it. If you're in my way and I can get you out of the way, I'm going to do it. So you've got a combination of that in there. I think you do have a condemnation you also have in there indignation. Trump felt, as he did, he got elected president, and immediately, in his mind, I got elected to do this list of things, and I have people trying to stop me from doing it. I have people that are throwing all this stuff at me that I know isn't true. I mean, Trump knew from the beginning he did not collude with Russia. He knew that. And he's watching this, and so I think there was an indignation there of, I have a job to do and you're in my way. There's also paralleled things that were going on that, I mean, you could fill a full whiteboard with, here's what was happening at this time, he said this and so forth. But you got to remember that there was a period of time we would learn later because FBI Director Comey, he would testify before Congress. Yes, I told Trump in 3 different occasions that he was not the subject of the investigation. Well, prior to that, Trump clearly knew that because Trump had that conversation. But Comey, before he gave that testimony, he was keeping his mouth shut about it. And there were all these leaks that were being reported in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and then everyone else carries it, that Trump is the subject of this FBI investigation. And in fact, part of what the report reveals is a large dealing of his frustration. And the reason that he was saying, we got to get this Comey guy out of there, is because Comey knew that that wasn't true. Yet the New York Times was reporting, sources from within the FBI are telling us this. So you can imagine, and you take politics out of it, here you are, a guy, president of the United States, or whatever your job is. There are all these reports swirling around saying that you are under investigation when the guy who is in charge of the investigation has told you, no, you're not, don't worry about it. And he won't come out and publicly say it. So when you understand all these things going on, I don't care who you are, that's got to make you pretty angry and make you furious and saying, what is going on here? Somebody take care of this.
Now, do you think Trump went wrong, though, in categorically denying involvement with Russia? And I don't mean collusion between his campaign and the government. I mean, he's an international business tycoon. Part of his case has not been helped by not releasing the tax returns, although you're not going to find out a ton of information from that, even if it were released. But still, there's the notion that he was basically saying, my hands are clean, I have no ties with Russia, when that's not true from a business standpoint. If he had threaded that needle more carefully and said, look, I've got a lot of business interests in Russia, it doesn't mean that this is some kind of grand conspiracy with the Russian government, he would have been better off, or would have been the critics would have been all over him anyway.
I don't think it would have made any difference. And I don't think his overt or lack of overt discussion of that was because he was trying to keep that hidden or anything. I think in his world, because that's who he is, he's trying. That wasn't even an issue. That was a totally separate thing. Everyone knows he has business dealings all over the world. And so whenever there was all the talk about collusion, I don't even think it entered his mind that he needed to also make sure people knew that, well, he was going to build a hotel over there once or anything. I just don't think that was part of his thinking. But ultimately, it would not have made any difference at all. People have dug in. They have created their narratives. And I don't believe this, and I said this the other day, that the release of this report is going to do anything to stop that from moving forward. Now, it's going to shift.
I mean, you've got direct mailings going out to everybody left of center talking about supporting the 2020 candidate based on that, right? I mean, it's just the game that gets played. And so it's too lucrative to let it go and to be fair about it. But I also wonder, you talk about Trump's upbringing. I'm kind of from that area, a little further south from where Trump grew up, but New Jersey, and so there's maybe that sense of, okay, you think I'm colluding with this guy Putin? Well, let me just do something to really tick you off. Like, I'm going to have a closed-door meeting. We're not going to release the transcript of what went on. Because there is all of those other little threads out there that are not part of the collusion discussion, but they're things that folks who don't trust the president are throwing up on the wall saying, yeah, but look at all the other stuff that he does. And this is circumstantial evidence that there's something more here. Even if we couldn't get him on this collusion thing, there's something else. Yeah. Putin's got something on him.
So I don't know if it is a measured response deliberately, but I think it works out that way. Trump, not the most measured individual by many people's measurement. I think anyone would recognize if Trump tried to answer every single, well, what about this? He would never have time to do that because you can always come up with, well, what about this and what about that? I think some of it, honestly, and we forget this, he is actually doing other things. He is a very busy guy, and this isn't his every single day focus, which I do believe was part of his great aggravation. It's because he had so many other things he's trying to. He is a results-based guy. I mean, that's the way he approaches things. He has these things he wants to do, and he wants to get them done. And when things get in that way, it really aggravates him. And so I think much of it's not even on his radar. He doesn't even think, I need to address this, I need to address that. Now, I do believe that he sees it to his advantage that Democrats and in Congress and those that are in, some of the big faces in the media are continuing to do that sort of thing, because part of Trump's persona is that I'm the guy that's always getting attacked because I'm the outsider and I'm getting things done. So they constantly are attacking me on this stuff. And that is sort of his character, if you will. That is part of who he is. And why a lot of people liked him. I mean, I heard a lot of blue-collar people just across the aisle that's like, well, if they're all attacking him, then he can't be that bad. That sort of flippant comment. But it does say something. And the more that they do it, the more that it solidifies who he is in the mind, the more it validates him when he says, see, they're just trying to get me. And I think that he's fine with it continuing at this point. I think that he does not care for, and he hasn't cared for, when the time of it takes up, whenever he's got to deal with it. But the chattering that goes on television and in the media, I think he's perfectly fine with that because it helps validate what he claims about the opposition.
No, I think you're right. And listen, one last big question, because I know you got a lot of nice historical pictures behind you, and the gentleman over your right shoulder, Nick, obviously Republican icon extraordinaire, former President Ronald Reagan, for those watching who aren't really clear on who the guy is, the Evil Empire speech, right? All the sorts of things that went on there. If you could bring Reagan back, you think he'd be shocked to hear all this stuff going on with a Republican president and questions about relationships with Russia? Or would he be like, yeah, it's just what happens. It's the natural progression of life and relations with these countries?
Reagan would be shocked to hear Democrats talk about Russia in such a negative and fearful manner. Because if you remember back then, and I remember growing up, Reagan and Republicans were often mocked for talking about Russia being dangerous, and how, in fact, they weren't that bad. And if Reagan doesn't quit poking at them, he's going to make them bad. And you may recall this as well, even as recent as one of the presidential debates between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, and whomever was moderating asked Romney, who do you consider to be America's #1 geopolitical foe? And he said Russia. And Obama said the 80s called, they want their foreign policy back. That is such outdated thinking. We need to get past all of this talk about Russia being scary and evil. So I think the thing that would astonish Reagan the most is that all of a sudden, that party that for years, and I don't want to say they cozied up to him, but acted as if that was some sort of, scare tactic, is now telling us that they rigged an election and that you've got a former KGB agent that has a puppet in the White House. That I think you would find astonishing. Maybe a little humorous.
That's an interesting take. No, you're right, though. Because they really were the party of, it's all a big misunderstanding, let's try to figure this thing out. And I think by many ways of measuring it, the Soviet Union was far more powerful than Russia is today. So logically speaking, why would the threat be today as opposed to then? So you're right.
Well, and I mean, not to get too deep into it, but years ago, the Russians, they released the Verona papers. These are a lot of documents. Like every so often, the FBI will release classified information for public consumption. And one of the things we learned was that when Reagan was getting ready to run for re-election, then U.S. Senator Ted Kennedy was communicating with the Soviets on how it is that he could help, or how they could help each other to make sure Reagan didn't get reelected. Now, you want to talk about collusion. Right. And that's undisputed, right, that happened.
Well,
so I think Reagan, knowing all of that today, oh yes, he would find it quite amusing.
Well, I got to say, I'm not taking a position on this one way or the other, but I am glad that there was a lot more smoke than fire with all this. I think we should all feel that way as Americans.
Right.
I mean, who in their right mind wanted this, even if you're not a supporter of Trump, why would you want this to be true? Or why would you be disappointed that it wasn't true, right?
Right.
Because it'd be so injurious to the country to have that happen. And I'm glad for the country. I'll leave it at that. Yeah. I'm glad for the country.
Well, and if I can, in final words here, offer comfort to both sides, if you will, Republicans and Democrats. For Republicans, or maybe I should say Trump supporters, not always the same. The aggravation that you feel as you see the exoneration occur, the great Mueller report saying, yeah, we couldn't find collusion, we couldn't find any of this stuff. Yet you continue to hear them talk about, well, we're going to hold hearings, this isn't it. We still think that there's something here. The comfort you can have is knowing that that's probably going to help Trump. That is because most people at this point are done with it and they're tired of it. And so think of it as this just helps Trump validate his stance that they're simply out to get him no matter what. Now, for those who hate Trump, there is a lot of stuff you can find about Trump to complain about. Policy-wise, personality-wise, real substantive things that I may not necessarily agree with, him on or them on, but they're real debatable issues. So don't lose the forest for the trees. If you're wanting some reason to really be angry at Trump and some reason to convince people he's awful for America, you can find stuff that's legitimate. You don't be too worried about this. So that's my comfort. That's my bipartisan comfort to both sides there.
Very nice. I appreciate it. Nick Reed, thanks for joining us on From the Constituency. Always a pleasure.
Thank you very much.